I've been reading various news channels most of this morning, and forgive me if I haven't been around for the last couple of days, but I was actually pretty unwell yesterday, so forgive me for not being around yesterday. However, today sees some interesting news. Interesting news because it involves the BBC at Pacific Quay here in Glasgow, amongst other places. It was announced today in the National that the BBC in Scotland has decided to cut its news content, news with inverted commas here, its news content in Scotland by 50%. So there's going to be half as much BBC propaganda on our TV channels from now on. Now, this is an interesting one because you may have heard me saying in the last couple of episodes of Inde-Car that support for BBC, in fact the viewing numbers of BBC's news output have been falling rapidly recently, and now it's estimated that fewer than 1 in 8 Scots actually watch BBC News. That's just about 12.5% of the viewing population. So it's no surprise really that the BBC is having to cut its news output, not because there isn't much news to put out, but simply because they're having to cut costs because nobody is watching their channel. Not only is nobody watching their channel, but the numbers of people paying the license fee are also diminishing as people get fed up of getting their news filtered through some kind of political prism, which is affected, let's say, by whatever government is in number 10 Downing Street. Now, we know from past experience that the BBC in Scotland has always been there to promote Britishness, and that's its primary function. I mean, the clue is in the name, the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's here to pump British news into Scottish heads through the medium of television. Unfortunately for the BBC, they haven't really caught up to the fact that certainly most young people in Scotland and elsewhere nowadays get almost all of their all of their news content, not from television, but from social mediums of this kind, basically Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, X, and so on. So half the population, I would say at least, in any part of Western civilization at the moment is not getting its news from any kind of terrestrial television channels, or if they are, it's in tiny little bites. So the BBC has, I think, or is in the process at the moment of dying a lingering death of 1,000 cuts as its popularity diminishes, not just here in Scotland, but elsewhere across the United Kingdom. Again, it's a sign of the decline and fall of a once mighty British Empire. And I think also the violence that has been seen in England recently is a symptom of that feeling of lack of identity amongst English people. They've lost their Englishness. They can't get it back. Back in the late 1800s, they gave up their Englishness and started to call themselves British. But British doesn't mean anything anymore. And they see themselves now as being largely stateless. So poor old English people really can't take any joy in being English. And the BBC has singularly failed to say that these riots are an English problem. They call them British because it sounds like everybody's doing it, but we know this is not true. There haven't been any race riots in Scotland, and as far as I know, there haven't been any in Wales either. And what rioting there was in Northern Ireland was a one-off, apparently, not a mass number of events. However, the expected 100 riots that were supposedly flagged up to the Metropolitan Police yesterday haven't really materialised. But it was pointed out, if you listen to some of the mainstream British BBC news channels, we're talking about the main network in London, if you watch all the way through, you would finally hear them admitting that this was the Metropolitan Police which had received these hundreds of alleged threats of violence in the Metropolitan Police area of London, not anywhere else. There might have been one or two others scattered around the country, but nothing very much appears to have materialised. Anyway, I digress. To return to the topic of the media, well, the British media, as you know, particularly the BBC, has been banging on about the failures of 2 Scottish ferries to be built on time and under budget. And they've been going on about this for ages, not just in the BBC, but obviously in the English-owned so-called tabloid newspapers, the Scottish editions of things like the Daily Mail, for example, or the Daily Express, or, let's face it, even the Daily Record. But what they fail to mention is that despite the fact that these ferries weren't provided on time and they weren't under budget, and there are still continuing problems in getting them out there, that's not actually all that newsworthy, because what they're not reporting is the major naval failures of the United Kingdom's naval bases here in Scotland. Now, let me just give you an example. For example, there are 6 attack submarines, nuclear-powered attack submarines, currently in Scottish naval bases, which were meant to have been repaired and returned to service, but which haven't, and they're just sitting there. One of the reasons for this is that the Faslane, is it Faslane? Might be Faslane. I'll correct this later on if I'm wrong, but one of the submarine bases in Scotland which refits and repairs these submarines has a huge crane which is designed to lift the submarines out of the water for repairs. And that hasn't worked for over a year because the cable ropes which are used to actually winch these submarines out of the water have to be replaced, and the company which made them has gone out of business, so they don't have a crane to lift the submarines out of the water to repair them. So none of these submarines have been in service because of that. There is also at least one ship at Faslane Naval Base which actually hasn't set sail for over 2 years. It has not been repaired, it has not been replenished, and it has not sailed. And there are continuing problems with Faslane Naval Base as well. So there are all kinds of different issues going on in the British Navy at the moment, and they cannot get repairs, essential repairs, done to the fleet of existing ships and existing submarines, and because of that, the nuclear-powered attack submarines are nowhere to be seen, which is a big problem when you're trying to protect yourself. Well, let's face it, we live on an island, from other people's submarines, such as the Russians, for example. Anyway, I digress. Let's return to the subject of newspapers just for a moment. And there have been several stories, most notably a reprint and I would say a précis of the history of one Mr. Murray Foote. Now, Murray Foote was the man who was in charge of the Daily Record during the first independence referendum. He was the editor-in-chief of the Daily Record. And Mr. Foote has claimed, pretty recently in fact, claimed that he has always supported independence. That, you know, it's always been something he's supported. And yet, despite that supposed support, while he was the editor of the Daily Record during the 2014 referendum, and 2 days before the vote actually took place, when suddenly the polls showed that the Yes campaign had started to lead 51% in the polls, suddenly Murray Foote and Gordon Brown cooked up the now notorious vow, this so-called pledge by the 3 leaders of the 3 main parties of the United Kingdom to give Scotland a lot of extra powers if we would just vote to stay in the Union. This is the so-called Devo Max, which was not on the ballot paper and certainly was not legal under the system of Purdah at the time. So there was a big issue with this, and Murray Foote was the man who put this in place. Most recently, Murray Foote suddenly came out and told the SNP that he'd always been in favour of independence. Nicola Sturgeon welcomed him to the Yes campaign, if you like, following the unsuccessful referendum in 2014, and he is now the CEO of the SNP. And the question is, would a man who professes to support independence deliberately go out of his way whilst in charge of a red-top tabloid at the time to actually torpedo independence when it was offered in the first place? And not only that, but breaking the law in doing so by producing this vow during the time of Purdah when no new offers are to be made to the electorate in that last 2 weeks before the actual vote. So I think Mr. Foote is a questionable character, and I wonder what on earth is going on inside the SNP that they think this man, who seems to have no morals and no compunctions about changing code constantly, depending on what is most advantageous to him, whether this is the right man to be in charge of the SNP's next campaign for independence, because he's the man who's going to be in charge of the entire party in the next few years. Now, to bring things back to a conclusion with respect to television channels, I just wanted to point out that the new Scotland channel, which I've been plugging remorselessly for the last few weeks, has produced another documentary which is on the Scotland channel as of today. And this is a shorter documentary about the links between Abraham Lincoln and Scotland. Now, what you need to remember about this is after the American War of Independence, where they kicked the British out of North America, they had to form their own constitution. They had to write their own constitutional document which described the new American United States. And to do that, they drew a lot on early Scottish work done in things like 1320, for example, in the Declaration of Arbroath, and also in the Claim of Right in 1689, I believe. I'll check the dates up for you on that. But both of these documents prepared by the Scots were the founding constitutional documents of the Scottish polity, and these describe Scotland as an independent country in which the people are sovereign over the monarchy. A lot of this stuff was adopted later by the American Constitution, and Abraham Lincoln did have links to Scotland, and these are described in this afternoon's documentary. So if you're interested in the links between Abraham Lincoln and Scotland, please watch the Scotland channel and have a look at this documentary. It's shorter than the one on the space program. This is a approximately 15-minute documentary, but it's interesting stuff all the same. Anyway, that's about it from me today, but just to balance things up, well, the BBC is now cutting its news content. Hopefully we can look forward to 50% less propaganda on our television screens, but then again, the BBC's viewer numbers are dropping so low, it's very doubtful that any of us will actually see any of this lessened news reporting from the BBC. It's to be hoped that the various unionist journalists who work in BBC Scotland will not be there that much longer. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. If you enjoy watching the channel, please like, subscribe, and share this amongst your friends. And also, if you can afford it, and you can find the link, which I'll try and post on my Facebook channel later on today, if you'd like to support the channel by making a small donation, I will provide the link for you to do that. In the meantime, keep the faith, and as usual, I will see you later in the week. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.